The first thing I saw was a champagne fountain sitting on my father's porch. The second was a woman in a white cocktail dress telling 50 strangers to make themselves comfortable inside my family's cabin. The third was my dad's old brass warning bell swinging in the wind, even though nobody had touched it. My name is Mason Rourke. And 3 days before that party, I had buried my father, Elias, a retired Army combat engineer who could build a bridge out of scrap steel and spite, and who had spent 42 years turning a rough little cabin on Cedar Hollow Lake into the safest, strangest piece of property in northern New York. I stood at the edge of the driveway, holding a cardboard box filled with his legal papers, watching expensive SUVs crush the wildflowers he had planted with my mother, while a DJ tested speakers beside the shed where Dad kept his fishing gear. For a second, I honestly thought grief had finally cracked something loose in my head. Then Diane Mercer spotted me. Diane was president of the Pinewater Shores Homeowners Association, a position she treated like a combination of governor, sheriff, and minor European royalty. She came gliding across the yard with a smile so polished it looked rented. "Mason, sweetheart," she said, touching my arm like we were old friends. "I am so sorry for your loss." I stared past her at two men carrying cases of wine through my front door. "What are these people doing here?" She tilted her head, almost disappointed that I needed an explanation. "We are hosting a community heritage evening. Your father's property has been neglected for years, and the board felt this was a tasteful way to demonstrate its potential. My father died 3 days ago." "Yes, tragic," she said, lowering her voice just enough to make the words sound expensive. "But unused lakefront creates safety concerns. And frankly, Mason, this place has been holding back the entire shoreline." I looked at the banner hanging between two pine trees. Pinewater Shores Renewal Celebration. Underneath it, in smaller gold letters, was a slogan that read, "A better future begins here." Dad would have hated that slogan. He believed any sentence containing the words "better future" usually meant somebody was about to take something that did not belong to them. Diane handed me a folded invoice. "Catering, entertainment, cleanup, temporary landscaping," she said. "Your portion comes to $3,800. I laughed once because there are moments when anger gets so large it comes out sounding like amusement. "You broke into my cabin, threw a party on my land, and now you want me to pay for it?" She gave me the patient smile of a school principal speaking to a difficult child. "We did not break in. The side door was unsecured. It had 3 dead bolts and a steel bar. One of your workers cut the hinges." She glanced toward the house, where a man in a black vest suddenly became very interested in a tray of shrimp. "Community enhancement is not trespassing, Mason. You will understand once emotions settle." That was Diane's favorite trick, turning every disagreement into proof that the other person was unstable. I had heard her do it to Mr. Alvarez when she fined him for keeping his plumbing van in his own driveway, and to Ruth Bellamy when she planted sunflowers taller than the approved fence line. But I had never seen her do it this close. Never felt the blade hidden inside that calm little voice. I folded the invoice and slipped it into my jacket. "You know what, Diane? Enjoy the party." Her eyebrows lifted. "I am glad you are choosing to be reasonable." "Oh, I am not being reasonable." I looked toward the cabin, where Dad's carved wooden owl sat above the porch beam. One glass eye pointed directly at the crowd. "I am just curious how many of his systems still work." Her smile thinned. "What systems?" "Dad used to say, Army engineers never retire. They just start hiding things in prettier places." For the first time all evening, Diane looked uncertain. It lasted maybe half a second. Then she recovered and laughed for the benefit of the guests nearby. "Mason, grief can make people say strange things. Go home, get some rest, and let the board handle this properly." The problem was, that cabin was home. Dad bought the land in 1989, back when Cedar Hollow was mostly mechanics, school teachers, retired cops, and families who saved all year for 1 week by the water. The cabin was crooked in places, patched in others, and perfect in every way that mattered. It smelled like cedar shavings, coffee, and the Old Spice Dad wore even when he was splitting firewood. He taught me to cast from the dock, change brake pads in the gravel drive, and never trust anyone who refused to show you the paperwork they were quoting. After Mom died, the cabin became the one place where he stopped being Sergeant Rourke and became just Dad again. He tinkered constantly. Motion lights hidden inside birdhouses, pressure switches under stepping stones, copper wiring beneath the dock, a sprinkler system with 3 separate tanks even though the garden only needed one. Whenever I asked what the extra equipment was for, he would wink and say, "Some people learn boundaries through conversation. Others need visual aids." At the time, I thought he was joking. 5 years before his death, everything around Cedar Hollow began changing. Wealthy retirees arrived from downstate, tore down old cottages, built enormous gray houses, and formed Pine Water shores to protect property values. What they protected mostly was their view from anyone who worked with their hands. Diane became board president after promising cleaner standards and responsible growth. Within 18 months, 3 longtime families had sold under pressure. The same pattern repeated every time. Violation letters, surprise inspections, impossible repair bills, then a friendly offer from Mercer Lake Development, the company owned by Diane's husband. Dad saw it clearly. They are not improving the lake, he told me one winter night while fixing a cracked porch rail. They are thinning the herd. 2 days after his funeral, I found 14 violation notices taped to the cabin door. The dock was called visually deteriorated. His wildflower garden was labeled invasive vegetation. The hand-carved mailbox he made with Mom was described as inconsistent with community presentation. Pine Water Shores demanded $11,000 in repairs and threatened fines of $250 a day. Diane arrived before I finished reading. She stepped out of a pearl-white Range Rover wearing boots that had never met honest mud. "Your father was a colorful man," she said, surveying the cabin like a buyer at an estate sale. "But this neighborhood is moving toward a more refined identity." I told her Dad's property was not part of the HOA. She smiled. "Boundaries evolve. Covenanters can be interpreted. Communities have needs." Then she lowered her voice and said, "There is a manufactured home park 15 miles inland that might suit your circumstances better." She never said working class. She never said veteran family. She did not have to. The meaning landed clean and cold. I watched her walk back to her Range Rover and realized she had probably delivered that same speech to half the people she pushed out. The next week, she filed an emergency complaint with the county claiming the cabin posed environmental and structural dangers. She circulated photographs showing trash around the dock, broken bottles near the fire pit, and loose wiring beneath the porch. The only problem was, none of it had been there the day before. Dad's old trail camera caught Diane carrying a black garbage bag across the property at 6:14 in the morning, arranging beer cans in the weeds, and stepping back to photograph her own work. 3 days later, County Inspector Calvin Price arrived with a clipboard and the confidence of a man who already knew his conclusion. He found septic failure without opening the tank, electrical danger without testing a wire, and structural instability in a dock that had survived 30 winters. $15,000 in immediate remediation, he said, avoiding my eyes, or the county may have to consider condemnation. He recommended 3 contractors. Public records showed all 3 had worked for Mercer Lake Development. Price's wife handled bookkeeping for Diane's husband. Their attorney was his golf partner. Dad had always told me to follow the money before following the argument. So I did. And what I found made my hands go cold. 6 lakefront homes acquired by Mercer Lake Development, all from families hit with nearly identical violation campaigns. Demolition permits filed before the owners agreed to sell. Luxury building plans dated weeks before the first complaint. Diane was not enforcing rules. She was manufacturing distress, lowering property values, and buying people out before they understood what had happened. I started gathering everything: deeds, inspection records, contractor payments, photographs, timestamps, and video from Dad's cameras. That was when Diane changed tactics. She filed for an emergency restraining order, claiming I had become obsessed with her, that my grief had made me unpredictable, and that my surveillance made her fear for her safety. The judge granted it without hearing my evidence. I was ordered to remain 200 feet away from Diane and prohibited from entering the southern dock area, the exact place where I had scattered Dad's ashes. I stood in the cabin kitchen reading that order while loons called across the lake and Diane's landscaping crew laughed from her illegal dock extension. Then I noticed something under Dad's old military map cabinet, a brass key taped to the underside, and beside it, written in his blocky handwriting, 6 words that changed the entire fight. "When they come for the land, open this." The key opened a narrow compartment behind the map cabinet, and inside was a stack of folders wrapped in wax canvas, a small recorder, 3 property deeds, and a letter in Dad's handwriting. Mason, if you are reading this, somebody with a title and a smile has decided your grief makes you easy to move. Do not argue with them yet. Let them get comfortable. Comfortable people make excellent witnesses against themselves. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the letter twice, because the first time I could barely see through the tears. Dad had known. Maybe not Diane specifically, but he had understood the kind of person who would eventually look at 40 acres of lakefront and see a profit instead of a family. The first folder held the original deed. The property had been placed in the Rourke Family Preservation Trust in 1994, with restrictions preventing any forced transfer, foreclosure purchase, or HOA claim without approval from an independent trustee. Pinwater Shores had no legal authority over the land because Dad's property predated the association by 17 years, and he had formally rejected membership when the board was created. The rejection letter had been recorded with the county clerk. Diane had either never checked or assumed no one else would. The second folder was even better. Dad had collected decades of correspondence, inspection reports, and audio recordings from officials who had tried to pressure him before. He had a habit of leaving an old cassette recorder running in the workshop while people talked. There were recordings of Calvin Price promising contractors steady work if they supported aggressive inspections, Diane's husband discussing how older owners could be pushed into panic sales, and Diane herself telling a board member that veteran families were emotionally attached and therefore easier to manipulate once the original owner died. Hearing her voice say that made something inside me go very still. Anger usually feels hot, but the dangerous kind is cold. It clears the room in your head. Dad's final folder contained a business card for an attorney named Marisol Vega and a note that read, "She knows the whole plan. Do not call unless they cross the porch." Diane had crossed the porch, cut the hinges, and thrown a cocktail party. So I called. Marisol answered on the second ring. I told her my name, and there was a pause long enough for me to hear papers shifting on her desk. "Elias Rourke's son," she said. "I've been waiting for this call for 22 years. That sentence did more for me than any condolence I had received since the funeral. We met the next morning in a diner outside town, one of those places where the coffee tastes burned but somehow still feels honest. Marisol was small, sharp-eyed, and calm in the way people get when they have spent their career watching bullies underestimate them. She spread Dad's documents across the booth and smiled without humor. "Your father did not build a cabin, Mason. He built a legal bunker." She explained that every violation notice, false inspection, trespass, and attempt to interfere with the trust could trigger personal liability against the people involved. Diane was not protected by the HOA if she acted outside its authority, and Calvin Price's financial ties to the recommended contractors made the inspection look less like government oversight and more like an extortion scheme. Marisol also found that Mercer Lake Development had borrowed $275,000 against projected profits from acquiring Dad's property. They had already filed preliminary plans for 8 luxury lake houses, even though they did not own a single inch of the land. Their loan agreement required them to secure title within 60 days. Suddenly, Diane's desperation made perfect sense. She was not just arrogant. She was trapped. If she failed to take the property, her husband's company would collapse, and she would lose the lifestyle that made her feel powerful. That did not excuse anything, but it explained why she kept escalating when any rational person would have backed away. Marisol filed motions to challenge the restraining order, but she told me not to expect quick justice. Diane had friends at the courthouse. Calvin had friends at the county office, and the HOA had spent years convincing new residents that it represented law and order. We needed more than proof. We needed a moment so public, so undeniable, that nobody could quietly bury it. Diane gave us that moment herself. 2 days later, Pinewater Shores announced an emergency vote to acquire the cabin under a so-called community safety provision. The vote was scheduled for the exact weekend I had to attend a mandatory cybersecurity conference in Albany. Diane had somehow obtained my work schedule. She told residents I had abandoned the property during a mental health crisis and that the board had a duty to preserve it. She mailed glossy packets filled with staged photos, edited quotes, and statements from frightened neighbors. One photograph showed me standing near Dad's flagpole with a shovel. The caption called it threatening behavior. I had been planting his ashes beneath the maple tree. Another showed the antenna on Dad's workshop and described it as unauthorized surveillance infrastructure. It was an old weather radio. Diane was turning every memory I had into evidence against me. The hardest part was not the lies. It was watching people believe them because belief was more convenient than courage. Some neighbors stopped waving. One woman pulled her grandson away from me at the grocery store. A man I had known since childhood asked whether I was getting help, and he said it gently, which somehow hurt worse. Then the old families began calling. Ruth Bellamy brought me a grocery bag full of violation notices Diane had sent her over the years. Miguel Alvarez had security footage of Diane measuring his driveway while a Mercer employee waited in a truck. A retired teacher named Pauline Grant had recorded Diane saying that people who could not afford rising standards should consider leaving voluntarily. Each story was different, but the pattern was identical. Shame them, find them, isolate them, then offer a way out through Mercer Lake development. We were not looking at a bad HOA president anymore. We were looking at a business model. While Marisol built the legal case, I returned to Dad's letter. The last pages described the cabin systems in detail. The birdhouses were cameras with independent battery backups. The carved owl over the porch had a wide-angle lens and directional microphone. The stepping stones near the dock measured weight and movement. The sprinkler tanks did not contain poison, acid, or anything dangerous. Dad was dramatic, not reckless. One tank held water, one held biodegradable purple marking dye used by forestry crews, and the third contained a plant-based adhesive that made the dye cling to clothing for days. The dock had hinged safety sections designed to lower under-control pressure, dropping anyone standing there into waist-deep water without trapping them underneath. The gate could close automatically, not to imprison people, but to prevent vehicles from driving through an active security zone. Every system had emergency cutoffs, warning logs, and cameras. Dad had designed the whole thing around one rule: embarrass trespassers. Document everything, hurt nobody. I laughed for the first time since the funeral. That was Dad, exactly. He could turn restraint into theater. Then, 3 nights before the HOA vote, the owl camera sent an alert to my phone. At 2:41 in the morning, Diane's Range Rover rolled into the driveway with its headlights off. Her husband, Grant Mercer, stayed behind the wheel while Diane walked to the back door carrying a flashlight and a pry bar. She wore dark clothes and gloves, which was almost funny because she still had her pearl earrings on. The camera caught her forcing the door, entering the cabin, and moving from room to room while whispering into her phone. Find the trust documents, Grant told her. If Elias recorded anything, destroy it. Diane opened drawers, ripped through file boxes, and overturned Dad's military chest. When she could not find the original folders because Marisol already had them, she started breaking things. She tore photographs from frames. She threw Dad's service medals across the floor. She picked up the wooden model bridge we built together when I was 12 and snapped it in half. I watched from my apartment 80 miles away, gripping my phone so hard my fingers went numb. Every part of me wanted to drive there, violate the restraining order, and drag her out myself. Instead, I called Marisol. Do nothing, she said. I know that hurts, but let her finish. She is not damaging your case, Mason. She is completing it. So I watched Diane destroy pieces of my father's life while Dad's cameras quietly uploaded everything to 3 separate servers. Before leaving, she stood in the kitchen and called Grant. There is nothing here, she whispered. Then we go forward, he said. The party, the vote, the demolition, all of it. We cannot stop now. The bank will take everything. Diane leaned against Dad's table and closed her eyes. For 1 second, she did not look powerful. She looked terrified. Then she opened her eyes and said, once the cabin is gone, nobody can prove what happened. That was the moment I understood the party was never a celebration. It was cover. Diane planned to occupy the property with dozens of witnesses, declare the HOA vote complete, and have demolition crews arrive before any court could intervene. She believed noise, numbers, and confidence could turn theft into legitimacy. The next morning, invitations went out for the Pinewater Shores renewal celebration, complete with catered dinner, live music, champagne, and a speech about reclaiming neglected lakefront. Diane hired private security, a photographer, and a local lifestyle blogger. She invited more than 50 people because she wanted the entire community to witness her victory. Marisol looked at the guest list and gave me a slow smile. Your father's system activates at 40 occupants. Correct? 45, I said. Then let her fill the yard. On the afternoon of the party, I checked into my hotel in Albany, attended every conference session, signed every attendance sheet, and smiled for photographs with my coworkers. My alibi was cleaner than Diane's white dress. Back at Cedar Hollow, cameras showed workers removing Dad's memorial stones to build a dance floor, cutting down his flagpole, and parking catering trucks across Mom's wildflower garden. Diane stood on the dock rehearsing her speech. Tonight, we proved that Pinewater Shores belongs to people willing to protect its future, she said into the microphone. Then she laughed and added, by Monday, that ugly cabin will be firewood. At 7:30, the guest count reached 41. At 7:42, it reached 47. At 7:55, Diane stepped onto a temporary stage built over the dock's central pressure section. Every indicator on Dad's control panel turned green. Marisol called and asked one final question. Mason, are you certain you want this played out in public? I looked at the live feed. It's strangers drinking beside my father's ashes. At Diane raising a glass on land she had tried to steal. And I thought about Dad's note. Let them get comfortable. Yes, I said. Let her give the speech. Diane waited until every camera was pointed at her, then lifted her champagne glass and smiled like the lake itself had elected her queen. Tonight, she began, we are finally reclaiming the shoreline from neglect, instability, and people who refuse to respect the future. She paused for applause, and she got it, because most of the guests had no idea they were standing on stolen land. Then, the pressure sensors beneath the dock registered 52 people. The control panel flashed ready, and Dad's brass warning bell rang 3 slow times across Cedar Hollow. Diane stopped talking. The center section of the dock lowered smoothly beneath her feet, not collapsing, not breaking, just tilting exactly 12 degrees the way Dad had designed it. And Diane slid off the stage with her champagne glass still raised, landing waist-deep in cold lake water. The front row followed her in a wave of silk dresses, sport coats, and expensive confusion. One man tried to grab the podium, but the podium was not attached to anything, so he carried it into the lake with him like a captain refusing to abandon his ship. For 1 second, the entire property went silent. Then the sprinklers came alive. Purple marking dye swept across the lawn in wide rotating arcs, covering every guest who had ignored the private property signs. Diane climbed out of the water just in time to take a full spray across the face. She stood there dripping, purple from her hairline to her shoes, staring toward the cabin as Dad's hidden speakers began playing an old marching cadence. I should probably tell you I did not choose the music. Dad had programmed it years earlier, complete with a recorded announcement in his own voice. Unauthorized visitors. You have entered private property. Please remain calm, avoid running, and reconsider your life choices. Even Marisol laughed when she heard that. Guests scattered toward their vehicles, but the automatic gate had closed as part of the safety protocol, preventing anyone from driving through a crowd of panicked people. Nobody was trapped. A pedestrian exit remained open. Emergency lights illuminated the path, and warning signs told everyone exactly how to leave. Dad had thought of every legal detail. What he had not accounted for was Diane grabbing a catering microphone and screaming that I was trying to kill them. That accusation lasted about 10 seconds before Marisol's media contact stepped out from behind a news van parked on the public road. Reporter Jonah Reed had been investigating Mercer Lake development for 2 weeks, and his camera crew captured Diane's entire breakdown. She pointed at the cabin and shouted, "That unstable mechanic does not deserve 40 acres. This lake belongs to people who can maintain it properly." Jonah asked whether that was why her husband had filed building plans before acquiring the property. Diane froze. Then he asked about the fake inspections, the staged trash, the pressure campaign against older residents, and the loan tied to the cabin. Her face changed with every question. Howard looks impressive until somebody asks for receipts. Grant Mercer tried to push through the pedestrian gate, but 2 state investigators were already waiting outside. Marisol had submitted Dad's recordings, Diane's break-in footage, Calvin Price's financial records, and the development loan documents that morning. The county prosecutor had spent the afternoon obtaining warrants. Grant was arrested first for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft by deception. Calvin Price was taken into custody at his home before dessert was served. Diane kept shouting that she was the HOA president as deputies approached her, as though that title were a diplomatic passport. Deputy Harris, who had known Dad for 30 years, looked at her purple dress and said, "Ma'am, tonight that means about as much as being president of a book club." He arrested her for burglary, evidence fabrication, conspiracy, and filing false statements with the court. The click of the handcuffs was quieter than I expected. I had imagined that moment for weeks, but when it came, I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I drove back from Albany before sunrise and reached the cabin while police were still photographing the property. Purple footprints crossed the grass. Champagne glasses floated beside the dock. Dad's broken model bridge sat on the kitchen floor where Diane had left it. I picked up the two pieces and finally cried. Not the careful kind of crying people do at funerals, but the ugly kind that leaves you leaning against a wall because your body has run out of places to put the grief. Deputy Harris gave me space. Marisol sat at the table without speaking. After a while, she placed Dad's letter beside me and said, "He knew you would win." I looked at the damage and shook my head. "No," I said. "He knew I would need help." 6 months later, Diane pleaded guilty to conspiracy, burglary, and civil rights violations. She received 4 years in federal prison. Grant got 6 for financial fraud and bribery. Calvin Price lost his pension and served 3 years. The HOA attorney was disbarred after investigators proved he had drafted false affidavits and coached witnesses. Mercer Lake Development collapsed within 90 days, and the bank seized everything except the properties acquired through coercion, which were returned through court settlements to the families who had been forced out. Pinewater Shores dissolved and was replaced by a voluntary neighborhood association with no power to fine, seize, or dictate what kind of flowers people planted. Ruth brought back her sunflowers. Miguel parked his plumbing van wherever he pleased. Pauline hung bright red wind chimes from every corner of her porch just because Diane had once called them visually aggressive. As for the cabin, we rebuilt Dad's flagpole, restored Mom's wildflower garden, and repaired the model bridge with a thin brass plate across the break. I left the seam visible. Some things should not look untouched after surviving damage. Marisol helped me create the Elias Rourke Property Defense Fund, offering legal assistance to veterans, retirees, and working families facing fraudulent HOA pressure. The first year, we helped 9 families. By the third, that number had reached 41. Dad's cameras are still in the birdhouses. The owl still watches the porch, and the purple dye tanks remain full. Though nobody has tested them since Diane's party, the story became a local legend, but people still argue about what happened that night. Some say Dad's security system was brilliant, a harmless way to expose trespassers and preserve evidence. Others say humiliation went too far, that even corrupt people deserve dignity and due process. I've thought about that more than I expected. Justice can become revenge if you enjoy the suffering more than the truth, and there were moments when I came dangerously close. But every time I stand on that dock, I remember Diane tearing up my father's photographs and planning to erase his home before a court could stop her. So I will leave the question with you. Was what happened at Cedar Hollow justice? Or did we cross a line when 50 trespassers walked away stained purple? Tell me what you would have done, and whether an HOA should ever have the power to take someone's home in the name of community standards. Share this story with anyone who has dealt with a neighborhood bully. And subscribe, because the smallest tyrants usually fall the hardest when ordinary people finally stop being afraid.